Hi everyone, my name is Lily and I'm the book blogger behind Utopia State of Mind, and today I'm going to be telling you about all of my contemporary 5-star reads from 2020. It's only actually part 1 because I had 37 books that I read that were 5-star reads in 2020, so I thought it would be better kind of to split it up roughly in half. I have a sheet of paper where I'm reading all of the titles and also like basically bullet points about why I loved all of them. So without further ado, I will just get started. One of the first 5-star reads I had in the contemporary genre was Yes, No, Maybe So. I've been loving all of these more politically themed YA books, and Yes, No, Maybe So was the first one that I had read that was like that. And what I loved about it was not only did it tackle Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, but it also tackled the idea about getting involved on a local level. I think that getting involved in local elections and like local politics is really important, and so I loved it. Yes, No, Maybe So tackled that and like canvassing and how an individual can make a difference and what kind of role we can have in the community around us. And also, I mean, the friendships and the characters were just so great, and it's such a fantastic author duo as well. So it was really great to see their combined project in Yes, No, Maybe So. The next book is When You're Everything. This is actually, I think, the second book from Ashley Woodfolk I've read. So I've read Ashley Woodfolk's debut, which was The Beauty of the Remains, and that was fantastic, multiple perspective about friendship and loss. But When You Are Everything is also about loss, but it's about like friendship breakups. And I feel like sometimes the loss of friends and like friend fallouts can be so much more emotional than even a relationship breakup, because I feel like sometimes in a friend you find more than a confidant or a sibling or a family member. Like there's something more than that to you sometimes. And so I felt like in 2020 I wanted to read a lot more books about friendship fallouts, because I think that in my life, when I think about like friends I've lost or friends that, I don't talk to that much, that kind of makes me more sad than when I think about breakups or, relationships that just didn't really work. And The Life and Medieval Times of Kit Sweetly was so fun. It was just about knights tackling patriarchy and gender norms and like gender stereotypes, but it had such a fun narrative voice that kind of just sweeps you along throughout the story, and you become so invested in Kit. And it's action-packed but also has these relatable characters that make mistakes that you can understand. I am a huge fan of relatably flawed characters, especially relatably flawed main characters, because it just makes it seem so much more realistic when I'm reading. If you can see a character make a mistake, I think that sometimes it's nice to use characters as kind of an inspiration, and so what they would do or how they would act and how that it would inspire you. But also for me, it's so great to see characters who are making mistakes that I would make, and so it just kind of makes me feel like, okay, yes, this is just really relatable to me. And so The Life and Medieval Times of Kit Sweetly had all of these different elements all combined together in a really fantastic debut. Harley in the Sky, and so Akemi Dawn Bowman is an author I've been following for a while, ever since Starfish and Summerbird Blue, and Harley in the Sky is, I believe, the third book of Bowman's, and so I've just really loved Harley in the Sky. Not only does it have a circus acrobatics kind of vibe to it, which I really love in general, but it also is about fighting for our individual dreams, even when they're hard and we don't know if we'll succeed, and kind of what sacrifices and compromises we have to make to achieve our dreams, and to even like begin fighting for our dreams and even begin changing the way that we think about our dreams. It also had such a fabulous mother-daughter relationship in a way that was so interesting, because the mother is not necessarily always on the page. It's more about the emails that are exchanged between them, and so that has stuck with me ever since I read it, and it's continuously something when I think about mother-daughter relationships, I think of Harley in the Sky. Today, Tonight, Tomorrow by Rachel Lynn Solomon had just fantastic witty banter. I'm a huge fan of like witty, wry, kind of snarky-esque banter, and so it just had that all to a T. It also is an enemies to lovers, and it has just such a great also setting of Seattle. I've only really visited Seattle I think once or twice maybe when I was younger, so it's not like I'm, you know, a native Seattle person, but it just was fabulous how Solomon is able to bring Seattle alive in the way that it's organized, and like the treasure hunting kind of vibe that we get. Oh, not treasure hunting, it's more of a scavenger hunting. I was like, treasure hunting, no. Scavenger hunt. It's just such a fun, emotional book that also takes part at such a junction of a transition before going to college, and how that can feel and how that can sort of put things into perspective for all the characters in the book. The falling in love montage also had such a fun and narrative voice. I'm a huge fan of narrative voices that are very witty, very snarky. Like, that's a theme, I guess, in what my preferences are for narrative voice. And so the falling in love montage, from the very beginning, I remember how impressed I was by the narrative voice and how it felt casual and vulnerable, but also like that lashing out vulnerability, but even on the page. And so not only in the dialogue, and I think narrative voice can convey so much information about a character and about a world. And so I just felt like the falling in love montage really nailed that. It's also was such a sweet, kind of precious romance, which also had some tension in it, and it was such a great character work, especially for lovers of rom-com, and as I said, the romance was also really precious. So the falling in love montage, I fell in love at the beginning, and then I kind of just kept loving what I was exposed to and the other kind of aspects of the characters and the world and stuff that was explained to me. Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know is definitely one of my favorite books of 2020 because it mixes this archaeological treasure hunting, so different than Today, Tonight, and Tomorrow, which is definitely a scavenger hunt. This is like treasure, lost artifact kind of hunting vibes, and it also mixes this idea of forgotten women and the forgotten voices of muses and women throughout history. And just, it was takes place also in Paris, and I've really loved Samira Ahmed's past book, Love, Hate, and Other Filters, and Internment. So Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know was something I had really high hopes for, and then just blew me out of the water with how much I loved it, because it was very much a book that I wasn't really expecting, because the other books have seemed very serious and very emotional in like a gripping sense, and Mad, and Dangerous to Know was gripping, but in like a mystery sense, which was also really satisfying to read about, and I love the characters so much. But it's the treasure hunting archaeological kind of puzzle thing that definitely made me love this book so much. The Lucky Ones is a book that is so much about grief, but it's also so much about characters that are flawed and that make mistakes and feel really relatable to you. I read this book in under 24 hours, and I did not expect it. I had like decent hopes going into it because a bunch of people that I really admire had liked this book, but I wasn't really sure if I would really like this book, because at the moment I had been kind of in a contemporary phase where just a lot of them just like weren't working out for me. And then I remember starting The Lucky Ones, and then just powering through it in 24 hours because it was so emotional, and the characters were they were just so vulnerable on the page in the way that they deal with grief, and the way that it kind of is a process, and the way that grief kind of speaks to you and sort of guts you to the core, right? It was such an emotional book, and I just was captivated. I have loved basically every book that I read by Elizabeth Acevedo, and Clap When You Land is no exception. I love novels in verse. In 2020, I discovered a lot of novels in verse that I really loved, and Clap When You Land has to be on the top of that list. It not only is it about secrets that destabilize you, it's also about family secrets and how to redefine ourselves in relation to our family and our relation to our experiences and memories of our family members. It was also delightfully queer, and it was also a book about sisters and a book about figuring out where we stand in our family and what happens when our opinions and our sort of limitations about family are explored and sort of broken through. The Henna Wars is also a book that I read pretty early on in 2020 that I just really loved. Not only does it have this queer rivalry, but it also tackles cultural appropriation and homophobia within your family and kind of in the community and in your society. And what I loved, I mean, flawed relatable characters are definitely a theme that you're going to see in this entire kind of contemporary favorites, but it just had characters that were just so relatable in that feeling where, you know, you're lashing out and you're really not sure why, but like you kind of know why you're lashing out, but it's something you're still in denial about. So that was definitely a vibe that I got from the Henna Wars, and just the rivalry and the kind of like childhood friends to crushes to rivalries to maybe something else, like all of that kind of progression of that emotional roller coaster just really hooked me, and I ended up just adoring that to pieces. Camp was a book that made me so emotional and made me kind of tear up, because not only does it embrace this idea of queer safe spaces, it also talks about trying to figure out a journey of self-discovery and re-self-discovery, right? We go through these periods in which we change the ways that we want to present ourselves to the world, or we change the ways that we identify and relate to the world. And so Camp was just an emotional book about that process, and it was so beautiful because, as I said, it has a lot to do with queer safe spaces, and so it was really great to read about that in that environment of this queer kind of summer camp. And I loved as well this idea about self-discovery and this realization that identity and self-discovery and who we are is such a continual process throughout our lives. And yeah, it just made me so emotional, and I love it so much. I've never been to camp, like to summer camp essentially, but if I did, this is kind of what I would want to go to. Black Flamingo was also another novel in verse that I read, and it was just such a beautiful story about drag queens and just the journey of discovering ourselves. And kind of what really struck me about Black Flamingo was not only how beautifully it's written, but also how important it is to find a space and find words that really click with you, and how impactful that can be. That first kind of experience that almost feels like a lock and key kind of situation, where it's you discover something where you never really knew about it, and it almost sort of opens up a doorway within you that kind of feels like, oh, okay, now I understand. Now I can be who I am, and now I can express myself in a way that makes sense, in a way that I never really knew before that I couldn't, and I never really also knew before that I could. So both of those, essentially. I'll Be the One was so fun. It had this kind of talent show competition vibe, which I have really enjoyed, and something also that, you know, it's like, that was kind of a guilty pleasure for me growing up, watching all of the talent show competition things. So it was really fun to kind of read about it on as a viewer, but also kind of as a backseat participant, because the main characters are competing in the competition. But I also loved how this was a Korean story about fat phobia, and also about like trying to be okay with who you are, and trying to realize that sometimes the family around us, how it can feel when the family around us isn't okay with that, how we kind of navigate that struggle as well. It also had such a precious romance, so it was one of those books where it worked so well on various levels, and that kind of came together to make such a great book. Six Angry Girls is another book, another political kind of activism YA book about knitting against the patriarchy. I have only literally in the last month become a very big fan of knitting, so now that I'm such a big fan of knitting, I appreciate this book even more so. But I really loved Six Angry Girls, and how there's such a core, strong friendship group at the core of the book. Like, you can see it from the cover, and it only kind of goes throughout the book about how these friendships kind of ground you, and how these friendships gives us strength and inspiration and calls us out, and all of those different things. I love kind of friendship groups being at the core of a book. That's another of my guilty pleasures. And it was just such a great book about mock debate teams in high school, and yeah, just knitting against the patriarchy, and kind of how we can be active against the patriarchy and the sexism we see in our society in a bunch of different ways, right? Like, whether that means literally knitting against the patriarchy, or whether that means, you know, tackling it in school, all of these different ways that we can be active and speak up for ourselves. Long Way Down is one of those books where it's been super hyped, and I hadn't really read any Jason Reynolds books before, and now I understand why Long Way Down is so hyped. I listened to it as an audiobook, which I definitely recommend, and basically as I finished listening to the audiobook, I immediately wanted to start again. It's a book that is so hyped, and for a reason, because it has such a captivating narration, but also when you think about the length of the book, and when you think about also the difference 60 seconds or the difference a minute can make in your life, you think about how poignant and how impactful that entire book begins, and then you want to read it all over again. So that was kind of one of those things where I'm glad that the hype train did not let me down on that one. I think it's no surprise that I Love You So Mochi makes it into this contemporary 5-star reads of 2020 video, because it was one of my favorite books pretty late on in the year, and it just has such a beautiful mother-daughter generational relationship thing. I bought this book for my mom because I was like, you're gonna love specifically that element of it, because it's about how in family we say things that we think maybe are protecting people, or we think that they're the right things, and then we realize maybe afterwards that it was the wrong thing to say and we were in the wrong, but time has passed and so many things have been said afterwards, and can we really, like, how do we come back from that? And in a generational sense, the relationships between mothers and daughters, how can we fix them? How can we work on them? And it was just such a precious book on that aspect alone. And then you take into the fact that there's the romance and the journey of self-discovery for the main character, about their passions and what they want to do potentially for the rest of their lives, like as a career basically, and the romance as well. And so I Love You So Mochi just kind of it delivered on all of those aspects, and it just ended up being one of my absolute favorite books of 2020 because of how multi-dimensional and how emotional on kind of all of those spectrums this book was. All Boys Aren't Blue is also a book that I thought was really unique in 2020 that I read, because it was a YA fiction memoir, and I've never actually read a book like that before. So not only was it kind of very unique in my mind, it was also such an emotional book about discovery and being Black and being queer, and also about acceptance and coming to terms with all of the struggles of your identity and your family and stuff. And I would just recommend it so much, because it was one of those things where every chapter kind of had a message to me, and even if I've heard those messages before, because I've been trying to educate myself, it was one of those ways where each chapter I felt like, okay, I understand this, and it like made an impact on me. And so I would just recommend All Boys Aren't Blue so much to people, because it was a book with such a strong message, and it was also a book that was so clearly so emotional and so powerful to read and also to get down on the page. Chlorine Sky was another book that is in verse. It's also a book that I read really late in the year, like the last week of December, but it was another continuation of all the books that I've really loved that are in verse, and this one was just about friendship and about the struggles we have with friendship. And I guess what was so emotional to me in Chlorine Sky was the fact that the main character deals a lot with the struggle of taking up space, and this is something that I've struggled with a lot in my own life, but knowing that it's okay to take up space, and not even just okay, that like we should take up space and we should grow and expand into that space. I think society is such a way of tampering down on people who are marginalized, or people who are outspoken, or people who are, people of color or queer, like all of these different identities. And so it can be such a struggle to break out of that and realize that all of these forces that are kind of pushing us down and forcing us to kind of shrink and apologize and stuff, we should actually be doing the opposite, essentially. And the last book I want to talk about in this video is As Far As You'll Take. This book is a 2021 release, but this book was one of the last books I read in 2020, which to me was just so much more emotional, because I really needed a good, heartfelt contemporary to end off 2020. It was such a book about discovery and kind of when you're first on your own, taking off, and can you can you survive, and like how does that challenge who you think you are and what your relationships are to your family and to friends, and about toxic relationships and toxic friendships. And there was such a fabulous element of it with the musical element, which I really appreciated because my family is very musical, and also family reactions to being queer and the varying degrees of acceptance and how you can work through that, and sometimes maybe you can't work through that. So it was such a great heartfelt book, and it was such a fantastic one to end 2020 with. That brings me to a wrap of the Contemporary 5-Star Reads of 2020 Part 1. I hope you really enjoyed and have added some of these books to your TBR. If you have, please let me know which ones, and of course which ones were your favorite books of 2020 in the contemporary genre. I will leave all the links to the books below and all of my social media links down below. I hope you have a really great day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!